All right, one thing that can happen with pollutants is called bioaccumulation. And this has to do with how toxins or contaminants accumulate in an individual through time. So this is how this might work. So we have a fish and we have a contaminant. And the contaminants are shown by X. And in this case, we're using a pesticide. And that pesticide is spread over the landscape, and phytoplankton, which are the algae in the water, take up this pesticide into their cells. And so some of the cells of algae, the phytoplankton, has this pesticide in it. The fish eat the phytoplankton, and that pesticide gets stored in their fat as they eat it. So they don't excrete it. It doesn't come out in their waste products. It gets stored in fat when it eats phytoplankton. So on day one, they eat a little bit of the pesticides, and that pesticide gets stored in the tissue of the fish. On day two, the fish, before it starts eating, already has this pesticide in its tissues, and it's still in the phytoplankton. So it's at the same concentration. But the fish eats some more of the phytoplankton, and then it gets more of the pesticide in its fat tissues. And so we see that the concentration of the pesticide increases in the fish over time because it's stored in fat. And so any contaminant that sticks to fat really well or is lipophilic is something that might bioaccumulate in different consumers as they continue to eat. The phytoplankton may always have a very low level of the contaminant, but because the fish keeps eating it every day, it gets more and more of that pesticide stored in its tissues. So we see day 3 again, it goes up, and now the concentration is even higher. So we see that this happens through time, and more of that pesticide gets stored in the fat of the fish. And this is one of the reasons why you'll sometimes, when you're fishing, see warnings that say, well, we only recommend that you eat so many servings of this fish per month or per week. And particularly for people that are pregnant or breastfeeding, these kinds of contaminants can get passed on to the fetus. And babies are at a very vulnerable stage that if they get high concentrations of different contaminants, it can have much stronger negative effects than if it happens in an adult. So biomagnification is a separate thing. So bioaccumulation is how one organism accumulates a contaminant in their tissues over time. Biomagnification is when the concentration of a contaminant increases as you go up the food chain. So bioaccumulation is for an organism. Biomagnification is for a food chain or food web or ecosystem. And so biomagnification is how contaminants increase in concentration as you go up in trophic level. And so this is kind of how it works. So there's this contaminant that's in our primary producers, so our phytoplankton, like we were talking about before, and the concentration in this example is 0.025, and that's just the concentration that's in the phytoplankton. The zooplankton, which are the animal plankton, eat the phytoplankton. They bioaccumulate the contaminants that are in the phytoplankton cells, and they have a stronger or higher concentration because they're eating more phytoplankton every day. The small fish, the smelt, have a higher concentration because they're eating the zooplankton and the phytoplankton, and they're bioaccumulating the contaminant in their tissues. The lake trout, they're tertiary consumers. they have a concentration of 4.8 parts per million, so much higher than all the lower trophic levels because they're eating the smelt day after day and they're bioaccumulating the contaminant in their tissues. And then if we look at the herring gulls, their eggs have 124 parts per million. They're a fourth level consumer and they're eating these lake trout every day, along with some of the smelt. And as they excrete their eggs or oviposit their eggs, there's a high concentration of this contaminant in the eggs. And some contaminants can make the eggs not develop properly. They can make the shells too thin. Different kinds of problems can occur, and that can really hurt the reproduction of the herring gull. It could be bad for people because we like to eat trout, and so this higher concentration in the trout than we see in the phytoplankton could be problematic. So we see bioaccumulation is what happens in an individual. Biomagnification is what happens through the food web. And so with biomagnification, the higher trophic levels always have the highest contamination if this biomagnification process is occurring. So basically, the animals eating higher on the food chain get bigger doses of toxins per meal. And this can cause toxicity and other issues like endocrine disruption, which is messing up your hormones. So there are certain kinds of contaminants that biomagnify. So they're usually things that will accumulate in muscle, fat, or liver tissues. And this includes some heavy metals like mercury, fat-soluble pollutants like PCBs, some pesticides, not all of them, but DDT is one example. And pesticides are things that could include either insecticides or herbicides. So we see biomagnification happen a lot of times, but it's the reason that we worry about eating too much of certain kinds of fish. And so mercury biomagnifies, and if you eat the little fish, there's usually not very much of it in there, and those tend to be safe. If you eat the really big predator fish, there might be a lot of mercury, and that's because of biomagnification. Mercury is a dangerous neurotoxin, so that means that it affects our nervous system, it affects our brain. And of people that get sick or have mercury in their bodies, 75% of that comes from eating fish. 45 states have warnings about eating local fish. And I mentioned before, women that are pregnant and children should limit their consumption of the highly contaminated top predator fish, particularly tuna, swordfish, and marlin. And sharks have a lot of contaminants in their tissues because of biomagnification. We also find that 300,000 to 600,000 children in the U.S. are exposed every year while they're in the womb. And this has problems with learning, lowered IQs, things like that, just due to this exposure and biomagnification process. So this is a very important thing to think about when you're deciding what to eat. And so you can see here, this ranks a bunch of different fish and which ones have the highest concentrations of mercury.